Wow. Thank you, Susan. And thank you, Leadership Louisville Center, for allowing me the chance to tell my story, because I've actually never publicly told it before. So I'm going to start off with a confession. I was at the last 100 Wise Women, and I heard Marta Miranda speak. Oh my God. She was so amazing. Her stories were so compelling. She sang up here. She recited her own poetry, and I thought, how in the world am I ever going to be able to follow that? So my confession is, I almost backed out. I did. I almost said, no way in hell can I do that. But instead, I remembered one of my favorite quotes, and it goes something like this. I don't need my glasses. Regret for the things that we've done can be tempered by time. Regret for the things we have not done is inconsolable. And I've tried to live my life with no regrets, and I knew if I didn't get up here and give this speech today that I would regret it. So here I am. And I also... So you know the book Lean In by Sheryl Sandberg? A lot of women are reading it, and I think that's a good thing. And I thought, this is my chance to lean in and tell my story. And I'm pretty sure that I've learned some things along the way that might inspire some of you. And I'll try to be interesting, and I'll try to be funny, although my son used to say to me all the time, Mom, you're not funny, people just laugh to be polite. So feel free to be polite and laugh at my attempts at humor today. So I'm going to share, sorry about the glasses, it's what happens when you hit 50. I'm going to share some stories from my life with you today, some decisions I've made and why I've made them. Some of the stories are going to be hard for me to tell, and some are going to be hard for you to hear. And some are going to make me look vulnerable. But I recently read a book called Daring Greatly, The Power of Vulnerability by Brené Brown. The title of her book comes from a quote by Theodore Roosevelt that has a very special meaning to me, and I'm going to read that quote to you today. And as you hear it, you can substitute the word woman for man and she for he. It's not the critic who counts, nor the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs and comes up short again and again, who at best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls that know neither victory nor defeat. Now, I first came upon this quote 30 years ago. It was written in huge letters over the entrance to the cafeteria at Air Force Officers Training School. So every day, 3 times a day, for 3 months, I would read that quote while I marched to meal formations. And I liked it so much that I memorized it. And when I saw this book with this title, I knew I had to read it, and I did. Now, in the book, Brené talks about women's fear of looking vulnerable. She says the real struggle for women is that we're expected and sometimes desire to be perfect, yet we're not allowed to look as if we're working for it. Well, I'm certainly not perfect. I've achieved some things, and I've struggled, and I'm not afraid to share with you those stories today. And in doing so, make myself look vulnerable. But Brené and I both believe that being vulnerable does not make you weak. Admitting you don't know something, but vowing to learn it is powerful. Admitting you're terrified, which I admitted to a lot of you this morning, but doing it anyway is powerful. Pretending to be perfect when you're not is weak. So I mentioned the book Lean In by Sheryl Sandberg, and I think leaning in is a good thing, but you know what? Leaning in is actually a pretty small and timid movement, and it's not really all that scary. And when you only lean in, you actually reserve the right to lean out again if it's too scary or if it doesn't feel right. Sometimes, no matter how much you lean in and how hard you lean in, it doesn't change the situation. So you have to be smart enough to recognize that. And you have to have the courage to do something else if leaning in isn't working. So I've come up with 2 bookend concepts to Sheryl Sandberg's lean in thing. And I call them leap and leave. And those two things take a lot more courage and are a lot more scary to do. That's right, there are some times and situations in your life where you have to kick off your shoes, roll up your sleeves, close your eyes, hold your nose, and just leap into something. Even if you're afraid, even if you don't know what's on the other end, even if you don't know you're going to survive, and even if there's no turning back. Sometimes you need to have the courage to leap and not care what other people will think, or whether they'll question your decision. Then there are some times and situations in life where leaning or leaping isn't even in the right direction. Sometimes, and this takes guts, or as Marta might say, cojones, it takes guts to turn around, do a 180, and leave. Whether it's a job, a career, a city, a friendship, a relationship, or even a marriage. And sometimes making that decision to leave is the hardest thing in the world to do. And today I'm going to share with you several stories of when I did lean, leave, or leap. I'm going to start when I was about 6 years old. We lived in Philadelphia, which is about an hour outside of Atlantic City, New Jersey. And the biggest thing to happen in Atlantic City in those days was the Miss America pageant. So every year, my mom and I would get in our pajamas, get our bowls of ice cream, and sit down and settle in to watch Miss America on TV. It was a fun tradition that we shared. So understandably, at that age, if anyone asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up, what do you think I said? Miss America. The problem was, I was a tomboy, and I had bruises and scrapes and scabs up and down my legs. And my dad, being the practical man that he was, more on my dad later, he would look at me and say, Susie, because that's what they called me then, he'd say, Susie, honey, you'll never be Miss America with those legs. Maybe you should come up with a plan B, just in case. And he was right. No amount of leaning in was going to make me be Miss America. And he knew it. Now let me tell you a little bit about my dad and then my mom. My dad never graduated from college. As a matter of fact, he never graduated from high school. His grandparents came over on the proverbial boat from Germany in 1900, and they were poor like most immigrants were. And they settled in Philadelphia, and my dad shared a bedroom and a bed with his two brothers. On Christmas Eve 1948, my dad's 18th birthday, he decided to enlist in the military, and he left home 2 weeks later. Now, he came back to Philadelphia after getting honorably discharged 7 years later and got a job in a mailroom of a local insurance company. He stayed at that company for 30 years, and he worked his way up to regional vice president. He never did finish his formal education, but he was and still is a very smart man. What he didn't realize, though, growing up in that poor neighborhood in Philadelphia, was that just 10 blocks away, in an even poorer neighborhood, lived a young Italian girl who he would later marry, and that was my mom. Now, her grandparents came over on a different boat, this one from Italy, and they were poor as well. My mom was the middle child of 6 babies born, of which only 5 lived. And she dropped out of high school in the 10th grade to get a job to help her family. Now, she was very pretty, so she got a job as a model for Lit Brothers department store in Philadelphia. And she worked her way up to be a manager of that department store, which back in those days, in the 50s, was a big deal for a woman. And she never went back to finish high school either. But she later married my dad, and they were married for 53 years before she passed away 2 years ago. Now, fast forward to when I was a teenager. My dad always told me, if you want to buy something, go out and make your own money and pay for it. So I had been babysitting since I was 11 for $1 an hour. But I saved up all my money, and I bought myself a yellow 10-speed bike with the curvy handlebars. Some of you saw that picture today. And if you go on my Facebook page, or if you look at the Twitter that I sent out today, you'll see it. So I bought myself that yellow 10-speed bicycle with my babysitting money. And the day I turned 16, because no one bought me a car, I rode that bicycle down to the local McDonald's and got myself a job flipping hamburgers. Excuse me, for minimum wage, which back then was $2.33 an hour. It was a hard job, but I learned a lesson at that McDonald's that has served me well throughout my entire career. What they taught me was, if you're not busy doing your job, which in my case was flipping hamburgers, do something. Pick up a rag, wipe something down, learn something new, prepare for the next rush, but always be doing something. So after 2 weeks, I got a raise, which is basically what minimum wage is for, to prove that you deserve to make more money, and I did. But my dad also had a good sense of humor, so when I came home from my shifts at McDonald's, he would say, "Get away from me, you smell like a French fry." And then he would say, where's that polite laughter? Yeah. Thank you. Then he would say, "Sue," because that's what he called me then, he'd say, "Sue, if you really want to maximize your earnings, you should get a job as a waitress, because if you're good, you can make way more than minimum wage." It's amazing the power of that little word, if. So the seed was planted, and I got myself a job as a waitress. Now, remembering the lessons I had learned in McDonald's, I always tried to be busy. So when it was slow at the restaurant, I learned to work the dishwasher, I learned food prep, I learned how to work the cash register. And when that restaurant needed an assistant manager, I leaned in and I got the job. I knew nothing about being an assistant manager. I was 17. But I did it. And when a customer would come up and ask to speak to the manager, I would boldly shake my little ponytail and say, "I am the manager," while my little yellow bike was parked outside in the lot. Anyway, so in high school, I loved to draw. And you guessed it, in high school, I wanted to grow up to be an artist. Well, remember my practical dad? Well, he said to me, "Sue," because that's what they still called me then, "Sue, why don't you go to college and get a degree in something you can get a job in afterwards and make art your hobby?" Again, it was pretty pragmatic and a practical thing to say. The problem was, I didn't know what I wanted to get a job doing. So when I talked to my guidance counselor, he said, "Well, you seem to be pretty good at math and science, so if," there's that if again, "if you can get accepted into Rutgers College of Engineering and if you can graduate with a degree in engineering, you're pretty likely to get a job." So I walked out of there going, "If? What do you mean, if?" I had no idea what engineering was or what being an engineer was, but I was going to do it. There was no ifs about it. Hey, I never said all my decisions made sense. As a matter of fact, after most of my big decisions, people would say to me, "What were you thinking?" And I'd be like, I don't know. So anyway, while I was at Rutgers in engineering, I needed money, so I got a part-time job as a waitress. But when I went in to interview for the job, it was at a Bennigan's restaurant. The manager who was interviewing me had to turn his back to take a phone call. So being curious, I looked over at his notepad to see what he had written down about me. And I read these 4 words: "Cute, but not beautiful." I didn't know quite what to make of that. But he got off his phone call and he turned around and he offered me the waitressing job. So I guess you didn't need to be beautiful to be a waitress. So this cute but not beautiful waitress was determined to be one of the best, and I typically made $100 a night in tips. And when that restaurant needed someone, an assistant manager, to close 2 nights a week, guess who leaned in and got the job? I guess you didn't have to be beautiful to be a manager either, huh? If I ever write a memoir, maybe that should be the title, Cute but Not Beautiful. Yeah. So while I was at Rutgers getting my engineering degree, I still didn't know what I wanted to do. And these are all true stories, but this is a really true story. So I was reading a magazine, and I saw the headline, and it said, "What company would let a 23-year-old be in charge of $60 million worth of radar equipment?" And the ad went on to say, if you're an engineering major in your senior year in college, call this number to see if you qualify. So of course I called. Do you know what that company was? It was the United States Air Force. That's right. When I graduated from college with my engineering degree, I joined the Air Force. Holy cow, no one was more shocked than me. If you'd have told me freshman year that I'd be joining the military when I got out of college, I would have told you were off your rocker. But I guess that wasn't really leaning in. I mean, I leaped in because I had no idea what I was going to be doing. And people were asking me then, "Suzanne," because that's what they called me by then, "what were you thinking?" And I was like, I don't know. Seems to be my answer a lot of times. I don't know. So let's fast forward 10 years now. It was the mid-90s. My life was going great. I was living in Southern California. I was working as an avionics flight test engineer. The Air Force had paid for me to get my master's degree in electrical engineering. I had bought a house at age 28, and I had an amazing boyfriend that after dating him for a year and a half, he had asked me to marry him. Now, he was young and good-looking. He looked a lot like Ricky Martin did back then. I mean, yeah. So my life was going great. He owned his own business, so he was an entrepreneur. Even back then, I liked entrepreneurs. And I absolutely loved his family, his mom, his brother, his grandparents, because being so far away from my family, that meant a lot to me. So one night, on my way home from work, I just had a feeling, so I stopped by the health clinic for a pregnancy test. And it was positive. Now, it certainly wasn't planned, it certainly wasn't expected, but it wasn't altogether horrifying to me. I mean, after all, I was in love, I was engaged, we were planning our wedding, I had a good education, a good job, I owned my own home. So after the initial shock wore off, I was actually kind of excited about it. So I figured I better go over to his house and tell him the good news in person. So I went over to his house and let myself in with the key he had given me. Now, I didn't even know if he'd be home from work at this point. Well, he was there. And he was laying down in his bed. And he was naked. And he wasn't alone. He was with another woman. So as you can imagine, all hell broke loose. All my hopes and dreams crumbled right before my eyes. And you know something? After that initial anger and shock wore off, do you know what crazy, stupid emotion I felt? I felt shame. I was humiliated and ashamed. I had chosen this man. I had loved him. I had agreed to spend the rest of my life with him. I felt shamed. So I went home that night and I unplugged my phone and my answering machine. I curled up under the covers and I called in sick to work the next day because I couldn't face anyone. I didn't tell my best friend. I didn't tell my mom. I didn't tell my coworkers. I know. He lied to me. He broke his promise to me. He cheated on me. And I was ashamed. That weekend, my friend was coming over for a visit with her new baby. Now, I'd been friends with her for years. I had been to her wedding. I hadn't seen her in a little while, but she came over, and she put that little baby in my arms. And I looked down at that little baby, and I started to cry. And the way a good friend always knows, she looked at me with wide eyes, and she said, "You're pregnant, aren't you?" And I said, "Yeah." And my story tumbled out of me along with my tears. I told her everything. And in the end, after I was done, she said, "What are you going to do?" And I said, "I don't know." Now, of course, my boyfriend apologized profusely. He swore up and down that that was the first time he had ever cheated on me, and he swore up and down to me that he would never do it again. He promised. Well, right or wrong, I believed him. And I decided to stay with him. I was pregnant, scared, and alone. I decided to stay because I thought it was the right thing to do for my baby. Less than 2 years later, I decided to leave for the very same reason, because I thought it was the best thing to do for my baby. You see, I didn't want my son growing up thinking that that's the way you're supposed to treat women. Now, it didn't happen overnight. It was insidious. But he had become verbally abusive, emotionally abusive, and this close to being physically abusive. In anger, he would punch the bed an inch from my face. In anger, he would slam the car door an inch from my hands and feet. And I knew it was only a matter of time before that inch disappeared completely. When I told him I had decided to leave, he laughed. He called me stupid and said no one would ever want me. And then he laughed even harder and he said, "Do you know that time you caught me cheating?" He said, "That wasn't my first time." And he goes, "And it wasn't my last either." He was gloating. So my decision to leave that man and that relationship was one of the hardest things I ever did. But it was the right decision, and I never looked back. Fast forward now another 3 years. I was in a secure but uninspiring job in California as a government civilian. And something was happening in the business world that I wanted to be a part of. It was the internet entrepreneurial revolution. Companies were being started, businesses were being formed, entrepreneurs were becoming famous, and I wanted to do that. It looked exciting to me, but I knew I needed something to bridge the gap between government work and Department of Defense and aerospace industry and the business world. So I started researching MBA programs, and most of them were really expensive, and they required 2 years to complete. Well, I had a mortgage and I had a baby. I couldn't quit my job and support myself for 2 years and pay 2 years tuition. So then I found the accelerated MBA program at Cornell. It was specifically designed, it was a one-year program specifically designed for scientists and engineers that already had an advanced degree. It was the answer to my prayers. It was 1 year tuition and 1 year loss of salary. So I applied and I got in. But when I got to Cornell, I realized something was really wrong. You see, I didn't deserve to be there. I didn't belong. My fellow classmates all had Ivy League undergrad degrees. They all came from wealthy, well-educated families. They had doctorate degrees or medical doctor degrees. They were really smart and they deserved to be there. And I didn't. And it was hard going back to living like a starving college student as a single mom. Hell, going to McDonald's once a month was a treat for us. And I used to cry a lot. And one night, my son was saying his prayers, and I overheard him ask God to please make his mommy stop crying. It was hard to hear. But I vowed right then and there that I didn't want my son growing up thinking that crying was going to solve anybody's problems. And I didn't want him growing up thinking that quitting was what you did when things got hard or when someone told you or you felt like you didn't belong. So I decided that I was going to prove that I did belong, that I did deserve to be there. And I leaned in big time, and I worked hard. And I graduated from that accelerated MBA program at Cornell as a single mom with a 3.8 GPA. But most importantly, I set a good example for my son. So now fast forward to 2004. We had recently moved to Louisville, and we loved it here. I was working for a great company with wonderful people. Well, mostly wonderful. Actually, there was one individual there who was hell-bent on making my life miserable. He undermined me at every turn. He told me to my face more than once that I didn't belong, that I didn't fit in, that this wasn't the industry that I should be working in. Well, I had heard and felt that before, so I knew what I needed to do. I needed to lean in even harder and work even harder, and that would fix the situation. Even though I was working 70 hours a week in a high-stress environment, I loved the work. I just didn't like the environment. But I didn't realize how stressed out I was and how it was affecting my life. Until one day, my son, who was 10 at the time, had been bugging me to buy him a thermos so he could take soup to school for lunch. I guess he was tired of peanut butter and jelly. And I just was too busy to do it. So finally one night I said, fine, come on, let's go to Target, we'll get you your thermos and we'll get out of there. And I was under a lot of stress because I knew I had to get him at home to bed and I had 3 hours of work left to do. So we run into Target, we get the thermos, and he was just so excited. So we get in line. Now, I'm not the most patient person in the world, okay? And I always pick the wrong checkout line. But that night, there was one woman in front of us and she had 3 items and I figured, okay, fine, we're good. Oh my God. She paid for one of those items with a check, one with a credit card, and one with a gift card. Oh my God. I said really loudly, boy, we sure picked the wrong line. And there was silence as the woman looked up at me, the checkout girl looked up at me, and my son looked up at me. Fine. So she finally finished, we paid, and we went out in the parking lot. Well, my son turned around and looked up at me and he said, Mom, you were rude to that lady. You made her feel bad. He was right. And I started crying in the middle of Target parking lot. I was rude to that lady and I did make her feel bad. And my 10-year-old son called me out on it. I wasn't that kind of person, and yet I was. I didn't sleep at all that night. I knew what I had to do. No amount of leaning in was going to fix that toxic situation at work. So when I went in the next day, it was a Friday, I made an appointment with my boss. Now, I had a great relationship with my boss. We're still friends to this day. So when I went into his office, he said to me, Suzanne, this can't be good news. No one makes an appointment at 4 p.m. on a Friday with me if it's good news. And I said, I need to leave. And he said, he didn't want me to go. And I said, no, I need to leave. And he said, Suzanne, what are you going to do? And I said, I don't know. I guess I could always go manage a restaurant. But because I made that difficult decision to leave that job and that company, I got to start my own company. I got to realize that I had valuable skills that people would appreciate and pay me for. I got to be a much happier and healthier person, and I got to be a much better mother. All because I decided to leave. Not leap or lean in, but leave. Oh, I still work 70 hours a week most weeks, but now it's on my terms. I get to work with people that I trust and respect, and it's mutual, and I love it. And that brings me right up to today, telling you all my story. The first half of my life has been a wild ride, and I fully expect the second half to be just as wild. I may still not be beautiful, or an artist, or Miss America, but I'm happy. Now, in her book, Brené Brown says, daring greatly is not about winning or losing. It's about courage. And Maya Angelou said, I believe the most important single thing beyond discipline and creativity is daring to dare. As women, we have to dare. We have to have the courage to make those hard decisions. I've got one more favorite quote, and this is really my philosophy of life. Should you fail to pilot your own ship, don't be surprised at what inappropriate port you find yourself docked. So ladies, go pilot your own ship. Don't be afraid to dare greatly. If it's time to lean in, then lean. If it's time to leap or leave, then have the cojones to make that hard and scary decision. Never let fear call the shots in your life. And I hope and pray that each of you may live your lives with no regrets the way I've lived mine.